Behind me is the P-38, and yes, we're going to be jumping inside. Welcome back to Military Aviation History. I'm Chris, and we are at the Fagan Fighters World War II Museum based in Granite Falls, Minnesota. An absolutely fantastic collection that you ought to check out. Big thank you here to all the Patreons, channel supporters, and of course also the crowdfunders for making Inside the Cockpit possible, since it is a 100% community-funded series. Now the P-38 right here, we're going to be jumping inside, but before that, as always, we'll have a walk around. Starting on the nose with, of course, the hefty firepower that the P-38 offers. On top, you find 4 50 cals. Those are 12.7 by 99mm machine guns, heavy machine guns, of course, and they can be loaded with about 300 to 500 rounds, depending on how you want to set them up. In the middle, then, we find a 20 Mic, and that is, of course, a Hispano-based cannon with 150 rounds, and that combined with the heavy machine guns on top delivers a lot of heavy firepower downrange in the centerline position as well, which is very much ideal for shooting. And in fact, the P-38, if you ask pilots of the time, the P-38 was considered as one of the best shooters that America had in the sky. Now, as we move then around to the right-hand side of the aircraft, notice, of course, also the front wheel. That would facilitate easy taxis, since the P-38, of course, has a tricycle landing gear. Now, the ammunition would be stored roughly above the gear well, the front gear well, where the gear retracts inwards. And of course, up front on the nose, there would also, depending on which version of the P-38 we're talking about, this one doesn't have it mounted, but there would also be a gun camera there to provide evaluation of the shooting that the pilot has done against enemy aircraft. And of course, sometimes that would also be used in the movie reels that were going back home. Now, as we then move towards the cockpit area that we have up there, the inboard section of the wing, on the leading edge, we have an auxiliary fuel tank, 60 gallons, and behind that we have the main fuel tank, 93 gallons. That is, of course, mirrored then on the port side as well. And then we'll talk about the engine that we have right here. It's an Allison 1710, 111 or 113, depending on which engine we're talking about on the aircraft. And it produces a maximum output of about 1,600 horsepower. Now that's, of course, at war emergency power, so you're cranking her up to 3,000 RPMs at 60 inches of manifold pressure. If you want to drop it down to cruise, you're going to be at around 2,400, 2,300 with 30 inches of manifold pressure. The aircraft also has a 2-speed, 2-stage supercharger, and what's cool on this engine nacelle as well is that we have this mirror section here that allows the pilot on both sides to check whether the gear is up. Now, what we have also here is, of course, the cooling intakes up front. We have 2 oil coolers there with the outlet flaps, and then we also have the turbo supercharger intercoolers air intake there as well, which is routed all the way towards the back. Up front on the engine, we also have the Curtiss electric propeller. Now, that's a constant speed propeller, 3-bladed. It has a pitch range of 22.7 to 57.7 degrees. And it can also be favorable, which is nice, to 87.5 degrees. Now, a favorable propellers, of course, means that you put the blade almost in the P-38, almost perpendicular to the airflow, minimizing air resistance. Because if you lose one of these engines, you don't want to have essentially 3 speed brakes on there, and that would of course not be beneficial. So by favoring that out, you're getting around this issue. One of the neat features with the P-38 is also that it has counter-rotating propellers, which means that the propellers are rotating against each other towards the fuselage, which eliminates torque and prop wash and provides it a very stable platform both on the ground and in the air. In the top compartment of the engine nacelle, just in front, we also have the cooling header tank that provides 15 gallons of capacity in the whole cooling system, and then there's also an oil tank in the back with 13 gallons. The engines also each drive an electrical generator for the electrical systems on board, and then there's also a firewall mounted behind the engine. As we move towards the leading edge here, then of course, in some of the P-38s, there would also be dive brakes mounted here, and you can see the dive brakes attachment point right here. However, in the this aircraft that we have here, this wasn't mounted. One of the things I should also mention about the P-38's setup here is that the intercooler used to be sitting on the leading edge here on the output section of the wing. However, in the J variant that we have right here, that was moved towards the engine nacelle, and instead we have an additional 55-gallon tank here for additional range. On the wingtip, of course, we have the navigational lighting that you would expect, and then as we swing it around, we have a large aileron, no trim tab, neither variable nor fixed on this one, and we have the first section of the flaps. This tear-shaped intake scoop is for the turbo supercharger that sits just above it. Now the turbo supercharger is basically the same setup as in the P-47, except that it is inverted. Instead of having the turbine below and the super compressor above that, because it's on the top of the engine nacelle, it's just flipped. And at least generally speaking, there would also be a small deflector blade that is added towards the cockpit section of the aircraft in order to avoid any turbine blades if they get loose from flying in the direction of the pilot. Now, the exhaust of the aircraft is routed towards the turbo supercharger and then back via the intercooler towards the carburetor of the engine. You may now ask, what is this big intake scoop right here? Well, that's for the normal radiator cooling, so that's for the water cooling. It goes in here, it comes out there, and that also features in the P-38 an automatic flap deflection depending on the temperatures that the engine is running at. Traveling alongside the boom then, in the right-hand boom, we have provisions either for baggage or also for radio equipment and navigational equipment, and also one oxygen bottle. And then let's move towards then, of course, one of the distinctive features of the P-38, the tail. We have a rudder on either side. It's a twin tail that is connected via this large horizontal stabilizer. The rudders each have a variable trim tab, as you can see, and then the large elevator that travels between the two vertical stabilizers also has a trim tab right here, variable trim tab. You can also see the mass balances there mounted on top. Now, as we move towards the fuselage nacelle there, where also the cockpit is, you can first of all see the ladder that is now in the deployed position for the pilot to then mount up. Yes, it is a rearward mount onto the wing, and then you move towards the cockpit. Behind the pilot would be the radio set. To the side of the pilot would also be the IFF set, and we also find the hydraulic reservoir in this area of the aircraft. And in fact, I've been warned as I go up this step, I have to be careful because some of the hydraulic fluid, as in all aircraft, it starts leaking and it spreads around. But that's how you know that it works. Now, with that being said, we also have flaps on either side of the nacelle in the inboard section of the wing. And now let's move on towards the left-hand boom. Remember, of course, the P-38, it's an American aircraft of the time, so that means construction as semi-monocoque, and the weight goes from roughly 13 to 21,000 pounds, depending on how you want to set her up for your missions, and also depending on which exact P-38 we're talking about. In the right-hand boom, we find two additional oxygen bottles, and you could also have the IFF system mounted. Yes, that's correct. And what is also important on the tail, although it's not featured here, APS-13, so a position warning antenna, could also be mounted there. And that would work exactly the same as in our P-51 episode with Twilight Tier. Now, moving then towards the wing, this is a very similar setup as on the right-hand side of the aircraft, although we have a pitot tube right here. And also remember the boosted control surfaces that we have in the P-38 that came mainly with the L variant, and since this is a J, the aileron does not have that boost yet, which would allow it to have better control at higher speeds. However, the aileron here does have a fixed trim tab, as you can see. Also, for the electrical power, the battery is housed only in the port side nacelle. And in fact, talking about the Twilight Tier that we filmed with the APS antenna, it's right there. And then as we move towards the cockpit again, yes, we're going to be jumping inside in just a second, but let's talk about the additional weapons equipment that you could mount on this aircraft. You have these provisions these pylon provisions that would be here. Sometimes those would also feature an additional compartment for a gun camera, but those could mount up to 2,000 pounds bombs, so a single bomb on either side of the aircraft, which is not too bad. I mean, a 2,000 pounder, that's like a 1,000 kilogram bomb, that's pretty good. Otherwise, you could also set it up with rockets, so for example 5 HVAR rockets on either wing. And additionally, of course, you could also have drop tanks that would be mounted in these pylons. Now, for the provisions of the drop tanks, there are multiple options up to 165 gallons usually. Now, without further ado, you know what we're going to do now? Yeah, we're going to be jumping inside. One take. Let's jump into the P-38 Lightning. A big thank you here to the Fagan family of Fagan fighters for providing this access, and all crowdfunders and channel supporters whose support made this trip possible. As always, we will go through this clockwise, starting on the left, moving over to the central instrument board, and then finally finishing up on the right hand side. Then we will also have a look at the stick. Starting out on the left, we find a window crank, as well as the fuel pump switches, and set in front of this, the right hand and left hand fuel tank selectors. We also have a landing gear handle right here. Moving forward, we find the throttle quadrant, and there we have, of course, the throttle controls. They are colored in red here. Behind that, in black, we have the propeller control levers, and then we have the friction control. We also have the landing gear release control. This is an auxiliary release for the automatic lock on the left gear strut that prevents retraction if the aircraft is on the ground. And then we also have the elevator trim tab control. And finally, the propeller selector switches. Moving forward, directly behind the quadrant, we have smaller levers. These are for your mixture control. And then we have larger ones that are for the carburetor air filter control. And then offset to the left, we have the propeller warning lights. Coming to the central instruments and gauges, first up, on top, we have a modern GPS system offset slightly from the position where you would have found the original reflex sight. Above the front instruments, we find the fuel quantity tank gauges, and then we also have a hydraulic pressure gauge followed by gear warning lights. Then, as we start coming to the six-pack and the additional gauges, we have an altimeter in feet, a vertical speedometer, as well as a speedometer in miles per hour, a turn and slip indicator, and below that is your modern course deviation indicator, which has a compass above it. And then we have suction gauge, and in the central position on the lower side we have 2 ammeters, an artificial horizon, and then finally a clock and another compass. Moving towards the right hand side, we start getting to the engine control gauges. First, we have a 2-needle RPM gauge, as well as an manifold pressure gauge. An oil temperature, fuel and oil pressure indicator for both engines is also there. And then we have coolant and carburetor air temperature gauges, again for both engines. We finish up with a modern fuel flow indicator. We will come back to the central position soon, but now it is time to go further to the right hand side. Here we have the flap control lever. And then right next to the pilot seat we find a modern radio, as well as the emergency hydraulic pump and a window crank. And now let's swing back to the center. Behind the control yoke we find various systems. We start on the left with the propeller circuit breaker buttons. As we move to the center, ignition switches, engine primer switches, as well as starter switches. And then these are set next to the pitot heater, external lighting and compass switches. A voltmeter rounds up this area. Before we get to the yoke, let's swing our gaze downwards. You'll immediately see the rudder pedals for your control, and then in black the offset control yoke for the P-38, which is set to the right of the pilot but then hooks over to be in front of him in a central position. Then in the center we have the rudder trim controls, as well as an hour counter, and on top we have the prop feather controls, as well as the oil cooler flap setters, and then we have battery, coolant and intercooler flap controls. Finishing up with the control yoke, on it you will find a trigger in the conventional position, as well as a bomb rocket release on top of the handle. We also have press to transmit buttons, as well as dive flap controls. Weapon selector switches and the aileron trim is usually located towards the joint of the vertical and horizontal lever of the yoke, out of sight from our perspective. Now it is your turn. What do you think about the P-38 Lightning, this tour, and the cockpit? Did anything surprise you? Do you have any questions or want to make additions? Let me know in the comments. A big thank you here goes out to the folks at Fagan Fighters in Granite Falls, Minnesota for giving me access to the P-38. Check out the description for more information on the museum and do visit it. It's a fantastic place, and when you go there, let them know we sent you.